Hi, welcome to week 6. It's Christine, and this week we're visiting the Carpetbaggers. Before we launch into the video, Robert had shared your feedback with me and April last week, and so it seems like the videos are the best way to introduce the material and leave time for conversation during the seminar. Now, as I mentioned in my notes, this week was probably the most challenging for us in terms of linking the text that you're reading to park resources, because we in many cases lack detailed information about northerners who headed south that are associated with our sites. The term carpetbagger expressed southern derision or criticism of what was perceived as or portrayed as economic opportunism, but we chose to expand our examination and understanding of these interlopers based on what Prince conveys in a more expansive and sympathetic definition of a carpetbagger as really missionaries seeking to northernize the South, rather than the crude, self-serving political and economic opportunists of the Southern trope. We'll present 2 sites, Boston African American National Historic Site, and then a short feature on Adams National Historical Park. BOAF, as we say in our acronyms, serves as a platform for exploring the experiences and motivations of carpetbaggers of color who continued their antebellum reform commitments in the Reconstructed South. And Adams, for that site, will tread the symbolic ground that Silber and Prince traverse and explore the commitments and convictions of Charles Francis Adams, Jr. and his evaluation of Northern interventions in the South. So just initial reflection questions about how Northerners understood Southern society and what motivated some of them to head south beyond issues of opportunism. Let's start with BOAF. The site was established in 1980 to preserve and interpret resources associated with Boston's African American community in the 19th century, its abolitionist community. I think we introduced this site when we were talking about Boston National Historical Park too, and you remarked about the overlap between the Freedom Trail and the Black Heritage Trail. We could take that up during our discussion. But the site itself, the park, is a partnership that includes 15 historic properties along the Black Heritage Trail, and most of these sites are associated with the 19th century African American community on the north slope of Beacon Hill. It was one of the largest Black neighborhoods in any Northern American city during the antebellum period. And by the end of the war, just to give you a sense of what was happening amongst African Americans in New England, 5 New England states allowed Black men to vote without restriction, and in 1865, Massachusetts moved to prohibit discrimination in public accommodations. Now, historian Stephen Kantrowitz talks about or mentions that longtime Black activists imagined that the Reconstruction of the South would be theirs to shape as they consolidated and extended gains achieved in the antebellum period and war years. Those gains, particularly from the military service of African American men, but also from the political commitments and partnerships that they had built over the course of the 19th century. Such activists included Lewis Hayden, the abolitionist, whose self-emancipation from slavery in Kentucky undergirded his lifelong commitment to the emancipation of enslaved African Americans. And following the war, to advocacy for the rights of free and freed people of color as an elected member of the Massachusetts House of Representatives. He's standing with his hand resting on the table in the photo on the left. And Hayden became increasingly uncomfortable with the interracial state Republican alliance. One of his colleagues, Joshua B. Smith, is pictured in that photograph on the right. He's in the center of the bottom row, and Smith was a successful caterer as well as a militant abolitionist and a longtime associate, as I said, of Hayden and Sumner. And he didn't have a political career, but he, however, was inducted as the first African American member of Boston's St. Andrew's Lodge. And that was significant in itself when we shift to thinking about some of the associational life of Bostonians, African American Bostonians here in Massachusetts and New England. These associations were really rich and central to some of the political and social activism of the community. And both Hayden and Smith were members of Prince Hall Masons, which was an African American lodge founded in the 18th century and played an important role in black civic life. Um, Smith chose to be inducted into the white St. Andrew's Lodge, which was an actual landmark in and of itself. But Hayden took a different tactic. He led some other members of the lodge to reach out to the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts, so the white founding lodge, but he was careful to assert that the terms by which the two lodges were to associate, which he said, and I quote, "on equal grounds as men and Masons, not as supplicants or beggars, for we wish no favors, only rights. We will go through no healing process or anything humiliating, thereby acknowledging ourselves clandestine and our past existence a lie." So in here is asserting the power that he and his cohort on Beacon Hill had exercised in Boston politics, and certainly their commitments to racial equality. Smith was a man of, well standing in terms of economically, and he was the primary mover and shaker to create the Shaw Memorial, though he was later eclipsed by more socially and politically powerful white advocates for that monument, for a whole host of reasons that I don't completely understand, and I guess that might be a research question in and of itself, what happened with Smith in terms of the memorial. But let's move on. And the rich associational life took many forms. On the right is the meeting house, the African meeting house on Beacon Hill around 1890, still very much a center of community life, although there were proliferation of other kinds of associations beyond church. And the figure on the left is Harriet Hayden. She's Lewis's wife. She was also a stalwart abolitionist during the antebellum years, the pre-war years, and it wasn't until after the war that she emerged as a public figure in her own right. In 1875, she became the founding president of the Women's Prince Hall Auxiliary and became a vocal advocate for women's rights. The communities in which the Haydens, or the circles in which the Haydens moved, were part of the larger black activist community. And those also included men and women whose commitment to emancipation and equality after the war led them to follow Southern trajectories, especially during Reconstruction. Many African Americans saw themselves as ambassadors to educate and uplift newly freed people in the South and to extend the institutional frameworks, both church and fraternal organizations, they had built for themselves here in the Northeast. Lewis Hayden traveled to Virginia and North Carolina in 1865 to establish Masonic halls. I'm not sure if Harriet went with him. And two or three other important families in Beacon Hill included members of the intermarried Downing, DeGrasse, and De Morty families. And many of them made their way south, first to Washington, D.C., and then on to the occupied South, where the Republican Party and Republican governments in the former slave states were critical to their visions for the South and for the realization of full equality, not only for freed people, but for them as well here in New England. George Downing, I couldn't find a photo of him, settled in D.C., where he obtained the concession to run the dining hall at the U.S. House of Representatives, and his position gave him access to politicians, including Andrew Johnson, to whom he advocated for black suffrage. And Mark De Morty also headed outside of New England. He went west first to Chicago, but soon relocated to Virginia to set up a production plant, and there he and his wife, Cordelia Downing De Morty, Cordelia was the daughter of George, helped establish and operate schools for freed people. So this sort of stereotype of economic opportunists doesn't necessarily hold, certainly for some of the African American carpetbaggers, if we want to call them that, but also for many others. Peter Randolph, who's pictured here on the left, is a terrible photo, but a photo nonetheless. He was a Boston AME minister, and he traveled to Richmond with a message of elevation and Christian propriety for the freed people of Virginia. So his missions included spiritual uplift. There's quite a bit of literature about the northern missionaries and their, I don't want to say clash, but the tensions in their sort of respectable Christianity that they brought to the South, and the resistance that they encountered amongst many African American spiritual communities in the South there was a sense of autonomy and an easy sort of cultural overlay between Northern and Southerners. And on the right here is Louise de Morty. She was a free woman of color from Virginia, from Norfolk. She is the same family as Mark de Morty. She settled in Boston before the war and built a successful career as a lecturer and public speaker. And when she heard the plight of New Orleans' orphans in 1862, she began fundraising to support the Colored Orphans Home. And then she was apparently invited by General Nathaniel Banks, who founded that institution, to manage the home, which she did from 1863 onward. So just these few short cameos raise some questions about the commitments of African Americans from Boston and how they saw the reshaping of Southern society in the aftermath of the war, their responses, their thoughts about their place here in the North, as well as their role in shaping the lives of the freed people. And I think it brings to mind some of the questions that we have here, not just these larger reflection questions, but also probably the need for more research to really understand what was happening during this period. Let's move on to Adams, which is a very different site. The park itself was established to preserve and interpret several homes associated with 4 generations of Adams, including 2 presidents and many prominent political figures. The park includes the birthplaces of John Adams and John Quincy Adams, and here on the right, the old house at Peacefield, where 4 generations had lived from 1787 until 1927. And the Adams that we'll concentrate on together is Charles Francis Adams, Jr., the grandson of John Quincy Adams, a longtime opponent of slavery, and the son of Charles Francis Adams, Sr., whose long political career included the post of U.S. Ambassador to Great Britain during the war, and his role was largely to maintain British neutrality during the Civil War. So Adams Jr., well, let's just call him Adams. It was pretty much in keeping with his family's anti-slavery and Republican commitments that he would enlist somehow in the war as a young man. And he was commissioned in the Union Army as a first lieutenant in the 1st Massachusetts Volunteer Cavalry in December 1861. He became a lieutenant colonel of the 5th Massachusetts Cavalry, which was an African-American regiment, in 1864, and later led his regiment into Richmond shortly after the city's surrender in April 1865. Now, following the war, when he was mustered out and he was a veteran, he served on the Massachusetts Railroad Commission, a regulatory body, and later as president of the Union Pacific Railway. But I haven't found anything to understand if his sort of investments and interest in railroads extended to the South and the rebuilding of the South. More importantly, I think maybe you might have read in Silber, beginning in 1874, Adams devoted most of his time and intellectual gifts to historical writing. And he was recognized throughout the profession with his appointment as president of the Massachusetts Historical Society in 1895 and of the American Historical Society in 1901. And around that turn of the century, Adams began what Silber calls his historical odyssey with Robert E. Lee in a speech to the American Antiquarian Society. He made a similar speech a few years later, in 1907, characterizing Lee as a paragon of Anglo-Saxon virtue and propriety in an address celebrating Lee's centennial at Washington and Lee University in Lexington, Virginia. Silber described Adams' speech in its effusive and unrestrained praise of the Confederate commander as the culminating point in the reconciliation of North and South. And I know when we were talking about Grant, the issue of Lee's tomb was raised, and this photo here is of Lee's tomb at Washington and Lee University in Virginia. Now, for me, that raises some interesting questions about what motivated Charles Francis Adams to head south, and how successful was he in his message? How much cachet did he have amongst New Englanders in upholding Lee, and what role did he really play, based on Silber's recognition that it was a culminating point of North and South and their reconciliation, not necessarily causal, but perhaps coincidental, a signal that the reunification of hearts and minds had been accomplished by 1910. And more importantly, how, as a historian, his views shaped popular understandings of the era at the time and subsequently. So again, are we asking the right questions? The Boston African American National Historic Site seems like a clear fit with some of the conversations and the readings, but Adams is a sort of second take or an alternative peeking around the corner understanding of Carpetbaggers and how Northerners responded to the challenges of reconstructing the South, or actually backed away from that commitment. As always, you can reach us at the contact information that we've listed here. We understand that your research projects, or at least the ideas, are really coming together, and we look forward to chatting with you about those ideas and about anything else that comes up over the next couple of weeks.